The morning of August 12th, 1986, began like any other Tuesday in the Riverside Heights neighborhood of Detroit. The sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of Gratiot Avenue, where Maria Santos had lived for the past 15 years, raising her 3 children in a narrow 2-story house that had seen better days. The sound of the Ford plant whistle echoed across the neighborhood at exactly 6:00 a.m., just as it had every morning since 1952, calling the men and women of this working-class community to another day of honest labor. Maria stood at her kitchen window, watching her triplets play in the small backyard while she prepared their breakfast. At 11 years old, Carlos, Miguel, and Sofia were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and moving through the world with the synchronized rhythm that only comes from sharing a womb and every moment since. Carlos, the self-appointed leader, stood 2 inches taller than his brothers and had their father's stubborn chin. Miguel, quiet and thoughtful, preferred books to baseball and carried a worn copy of Tom Sawyer everywhere he went. Sofia, the only girl, could outrun both her brothers and had dreams of becoming a teacher like Mrs. Rodriguez down the street. The Santos family had moved to Detroit from San Antonio in 1971, when Maria was just 19 and pregnant with possibilities. Her husband Roberto had gotten work at the Rouge plant, and they had scraped together enough money for a down payment on the house at 2847 Gratiot Avenue. The neighborhood was a tapestry of immigrant dreams, with Polish families who had been there for generations living alongside newer arrivals from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the rural South. Everyone knew everyone, and children played freely in the streets until the streetlights came on, safe under the watchful eyes of mothers who sat on their front porches, sharing gossip and keeping vigilant watch over their community. Roberto had been gone for 3 years now, killed in an industrial accident that the insurance company fought for 18 months before finally paying out a settlement that barely covered his funeral expenses. Maria worked double shifts at the packing house on Jefferson Avenue, her hands raw from the cold and the constant motion of sorting and packing, but she never complained. She had her children, her faith, and her community, and that was enough to build a life on. At 7:05 that Tuesday morning, Maria called the triplets inside for breakfast. They burst through the back door like a small hurricane, Miguel carefully closing his book and placing it on the counter, Sofia's dark hair flying loose from the braids Maria had plaited the night before, and Carlos already talking about the baseball game planned for that afternoon. The kitchen filled with the warm smell of chorizo and eggs, fresh tortillas that Maria had made before dawn, and the sound of rapid-fire Spanish mixed with English as the children planned their day. School would start again in 2 weeks, but for now, summer stretched endlessly ahead of them. The boys had odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns and helping elderly neighbors with their groceries, always splitting their earnings 3 ways, despite Sofia's protests that she could earn her own money. Sofia spent her days at the library on East Warren, where the librarian, Mrs. Chen, had introduced her to Nancy Drew mysteries and encouraged her love of reading. All 3 children were honor students, their report cards displayed proudly on the refrigerator next to Maria's work schedule and the church bulletin. After breakfast, Maria watched from the window as the triplets headed down Gratiot Avenue toward the community center, where a summer program offered activities and supervision for neighborhood children. Carlos carried a worn baseball glove that had belonged to his father. Miguel had his book tucked under his arm, and Sofia skipped between her brothers, her voice carrying back to the house as she narrated some elaborate story about treasure hunters and secret codes. It was the last time Maria would see her children alive, though she wouldn't know that for 30 years. At the community center, Sister Margaret O'Brien had been running the summer program for 8 years. A no-nonsense woman from South Boston who had come to Detroit fresh out of the convent, She had quickly earned the respect and love of the neighborhood children through her combination of firm discipline and genuine care. The center occupied the basement of St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church, and every morning from 8 to noon, she supervised activities for roughly 40 children whose parents worked during the day. The triplets were among Sister Margaret's favorites, though she would never have admitted it. They were polite, helpful, and looked out for the younger children with a maturity that sometimes broke her heart. Carlos had organized a reading circle for the kids who struggled with their letters. Miguel helped tutor children in math, and Sofia had started a small drama group that performed plays for the elderly residents at the nursing home on Mack Avenue. That Tuesday morning unfolded with the familiar rhythm of summer activities. The children played games in the church basement, worked on art projects, using donated supplies from the local schools, and listened to Sister Margaret read from Charlotte's Web. At 10:30, she sent them outside to the small playground behind the church for their usual break, reminding them to stay within the fenced area and to come back when she rang the bell at 11 o'clock. The playground was visible from the basement windows, and Sister Margaret glanced up from her paperwork periodically to check on the children. The Santos triplets had claimed their usual spot on the swing set, with Sofia in the middle and her brothers on either side, all three of them pumping their legs in unison and seeing who could swing the highest. Other children played on the monkey bars and the slide that the parish had installed just 2 years earlier, their voices creating the soundtrack of a normal summer day. At exactly 10:55, Sister Margaret looked up to see a man she didn't recognize talking to the triplets by the fence. He was middle-aged, wearing clean work clothes and a Detroit Tigers baseball cap, and he seemed to know the children well enough that they weren't showing any signs of alarm. From her position at the basement window, she could see Carlos nodding enthusiastically and Miguel showing the man his book. The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be photographs, spreading them on the ground for the children to examine. Sister Margaret felt a prickle of unease, but told herself she was being overly cautious. The man looked respectable enough, and the children seemed comfortable with him. Perhaps he was a relative she hadn't met, or a friend of their mother's. Still, she made a mental note to ask the triplets about their conversation when they came back inside. She turned back to her paperwork for what couldn't have been more than 2 minutes, and when she looked up again, the playground was empty except for a handful of other children. The Santos triplets were gone, and so was the man in the tiger's cap. Sister Margaret's heart began to race as she scanned the playground more carefully, thinking perhaps they had wandered to a different area or gone to use the bathroom. But the church grounds were small and completely enclosed, with only one gate that led to the street, and she had a clear view of everything. She rushed outside, calling their names, checking the small storage shed, and the area behind the dumpsters where children sometimes hid during games of hide and seek. The other children looked up from their play, confused by the urgency in her voice. "Have you seen Carlos, Miguel, and Sofia?" she asked a group of girls who'd been playing jump rope near the slide. They shook their heads, saying they had been playing their own game and hadn't noticed where the triplets went. Sister Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps they had gone home because one of them felt sick. Maybe their mother had come to pick them up early, and she had somehow missed seeing her. But even as she tried to rationalize their absence, a cold fear settled in her stomach. In 8 years of running the summer program, no child had ever left the playground without permission, and the Santos children were among the most responsible she had ever supervised. She gathered the remaining children and led them back to the basement, then immediately called Maria at the packing house. The phone rang 6 times before a supervisor answered, explaining that Maria was on the line and couldn't come to the phone right away. "This is Sister Margaret from St. Bartholomew's," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I need to speak with Maria Santos immediately. It's about her children." The few minutes it took for Maria to reach the phone felt like hours. When she finally came on the line, her voice was breathless with worry. "Sister Margaret, what's wrong? Are they hurt?" The sister explained what had happened, describing the man she had seen and the children's disappearance. Maria's response was immediate and terrifying in its certainty. "I'm coming right now. Call the police." Maria abandoned her shift without explanation, ignoring her supervisor's shouts about lost wages and job security. Nothing mattered except getting to her children. She ran the 12 blocks from the packing house to the church, her work boots slapping against the pavement and her breath coming in sharp gasps. Neighbors called out to her as she passed, asking what was wrong, but she didn't have time to stop and explain. She arrived at St. Bartholomew's just as the first police car pulled up to the curb. Officers David Martinez and Patricia Coleman had been partners for 3 years and had responded to countless calls involving missing children, though in their experience most turned out to be simple misunderstandings or children who had wandered off and would be found within a few hours. They approached the situation with professional calm, though Officer Martinez felt a personal connection to the case, having grown up in a similar neighborhood and understanding the tight-knit community dynamics that made a child's disappearance so alarming. Sister Margaret led them to the playground and recounted exactly what she had seen, describing the man in detail, approximately 40 years old, average height and build, clean-shaven, wearing blue work pants, a white t-shirt, and a Detroit Tigers cap. She emphasized that the children had seemed to know him and weren't displaying any signs of fear or distress. Officer Coleman took detailed notes while Officer Martinez examined the area where the man had been standing, looking for any physical evidence he might have left behind. Maria paced frantically around the playground, calling her children's names and peering over the fence into the alley behind the church. "They wouldn't just leave," she kept repeating. "They're good children. They follow the rules. Something's wrong." Her voice broke on the last words, and Sister Margaret put an arm around her shoulders, trying to offer comfort while fighting her own guilt and fear. The officers expanded their search to the surrounding blocks, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen the Triplets or the man Sister Margaret had described. The neighborhood rallied immediately, with mothers calling their own children inside and fathers leaving work early to join the search. By noon, more than 50 people were walking the streets, checking empty lots, abandoned buildings, and any place where children might hide or be hidden. At 12:15, Mrs. Elena Gutierrez, who lived 3 houses down from the Santos family, remembered seeing a blue pickup truck parked on Gratiot Avenue that morning, around the time the children would have been at the community center. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, since there was often work traffic in the neighborhood. But now the memory took on sinister significance. The truck had been idling outside the Kowalski house, and the driver had been watching the street with what she now realized might have been unusual interest. The police immediately put out a BOLO alert for a blue pickup truck. Though without a license plate number or more specific description, it was little more than a hope that someone else had noticed more details. They also contacted the FBI, since the disappearance of 3 children simultaneously suggested the possibility of kidnapping, which would make it a federal case. As the afternoon wore on without any sign of the triplets, the mood in the neighborhood shifted from concern to dread. Maria sat in the church basement, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had closed their shops and abandoned their daily routines to offer support. Mrs. Rodriguez brought food that no one touched. Father McKenna led prayers, while children too young to understand what was happening played quietly in the corner. The phone rang constantly with offers of help, reports of possible sightings that led nowhere, and questions from local news stations that had gotten word of the story. By evening, the search had expanded to include police dogs and volunteer searchers from neighboring communities. The local television news led with the story, showing school photos of the triplets and asking anyone with information to contact the police. Maria appeared on camera, her voice steady despite her tears, pleading for the return of her children and asking anyone who might have them to please let them come home. The first 48 hours were crucial in missing person cases. Everyone knew that, and as Wednesday turned into Thursday with no sign of the triplets, hope began to fade. Police had interviewed everyone in the neighborhood, followed up on dozens of tips and possible sightings, and expanded their search to include surrounding counties. The blue pickup truck had been reported in 3 different locations, but none of the leads had panned out. Detective Raymond Foster had taken over the case as the lead investigator. A 20-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department with a specialty in crimes against children, he approached the Santos case with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the department's most successful investigators. He spent hours with Maria, learning every detail about the children's routines, their friends, their interests, and anyone who might have had contact with them. The investigation revealed that the triplets were well known throughout the neighborhood, beloved by shopkeepers who always had a kind word and sometimes a piece of candy for them when they ran errands for their mother. They were altar servers at St. Bartholomew's, regular visitors to the library, and fixtures at the community center. No one could think of anyone who might want to harm them or any reason someone would target them specifically. Detective Foster also spent considerable time with Sister Margaret, going over her account of that Tuesday morning again and again, trying to extract any additional details that might help identify the man she had seen. Under hypnosis administered by a police psychologist, she was able to remember that the man had a small scar on his left hand and that one of the photographs he had shown the children appeared to be of a baseball stadium. But these details, while potentially significant, didn't lead to any immediate breakthroughs. The FBI brought additional resources to the investigation, including behavioral analysts who created a profile of the likely perpetrator. Based on the fact that he had approached the children openly and that they had seemed comfortable with him, they theorized that he was someone who had established a relationship with them over time, possibly someone who lived or worked in the neighborhood. The fact that he had photographs suggested premeditation, and the successful abduction of 3 children simultaneously indicated significant planning and possibly assistance from accomplices. As days turned into weeks, the case began to consume Detective Foster's life. He drove through the neighborhood at all hours, sometimes in his official vehicle and sometimes in his personal car, looking for anything that might have been missed. He interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses, followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely, and maintained regular contact with Maria, who had become a shadow of the vibrant woman she had been before her children disappeared. Maria refused to return to work, spending her days walking the streets and posting flyers with the children's pictures on every telephone pole and storefront window. She slept fitfully when exhaustion finally overtook her, and ate only when neighbors forced food into her hands. The community continued to support her with donations and prayers, but as the investigation stretched into its 2nd month with no significant developments, some people began to whisper about the possibility that the triplets might never come home. The media attention that had initially seemed so helpful began to fade as other stories took precedence. The Santos case was reduced to periodic updates in the local news, and then to mentions only on the anniversaries of their disappearance. Detective Foster continued to work the case, but with no new leads and pressure from his superiors to focus on more recent crimes. He was forced to divide his attention among multiple investigations. By Christmas of 1986, the official search had largely ended, though the case remained open and Detective Foster continued to follow up on leads as they came in. Maria had created a shrine in her living room, with the children's school photos, their favorite toys, and candles that she kept burning around the clock. She aged years in those few months. her dark hair showing streaks of grey and her face marked by the constant weight of not knowing what had happened to her children. The neighborhood gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though the Santos house remained a somber reminder of that terrible Tuesday in August. Children still played in the streets, but their parents watched more carefully, and the easy trust that had characterized the community was forever changed. Sister Margaret continued to run the summer program, but she never again allowed children onto the playground without being directly supervised, and she found herself unable to enjoy the carefree laughter that had once been her greatest joy in working with children. Years passed with no resolution. Detective Foster retired in 1995, handing over his files to Detective Sandra Williams, who reviewed the case thoroughly, but found no new angles to pursue. The blue pickup truck had never been found, despite hundreds of reports from across the Midwest. The man Sister Margaret had seen vanished as completely as the children themselves, leaving behind no trace except a nun's memory of a brief conversation by a fence. Maria never moved from the house on Graciette Avenue, though friends and family urged her to start fresh somewhere else. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving the place where her children's belongings remained exactly as they had left them. Miguel's books lined his shelf, Carlos's baseball glove sat on his dresser, and Sophia's drawings covered the refrigerator. Every night she set 4 places at the dinner table, and every morning she made enough breakfast for a family of 4. In 1996, exactly 10 years after the disappearance, Maria received a letter postmarked from Phoenix, Arizona, with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of 3 teenagers who looked remarkably like how she imagined her children might appear at the age of 21. The photograph showed them standing in front of what appeared to be a southwestern landscape, smiling and healthy-looking. On the back, someone had written in block letters, "They are safe and loved." Detective Williams investigated the photograph thoroughly, but was unable to trace its origin. The paper was common stock available at any office supply store, the ink from a standard ballpoint pen. No fingerprints were recoverable, and analysis of the photograph itself revealed only that it had been taken with an inexpensive camera sometime in the mid-1990s. The facial recognition technology available at the time was not sophisticated enough to definitively confirm whether the teenagers in the photograph were the Santos triplets. The photograph brought Maria both hope and torment. If it was really her children, they were alive and apparently well cared for, but they were also living completely different lives with people who had stolen them from her. If it wasn't her children, then someone was playing a cruel joke on a grieving mother. She carried the photograph everywhere, showing it to anyone who would look, asking if they thought the teenagers looked like her babies. More years passed. Maria's health began to decline, the stress and heartbreak of the previous decade taking their toll on her body. She developed high blood pressure and diabetes, conditions that were manageable with medication, but served as constant reminders that time was passing and her children were growing up without her. She attended every community meeting about child safety, volunteered with organizations that helped families of missing children, and never stopped believing that someday she would learn what happened on that August morning. Detective Williams retired in 2008, passing the case files to Detective Michael Chen, who had grown up hearing stories about the Santos triplets from his parents, who had lived in a neighboring district at the time of the disappearance. He approached the cold case with fresh eyes and new technology, but despite advances in forensic science and database searches, he found no new leads to pursue. The case remained as mysterious as it had been 22 years earlier. In 2010, Maria received another letter, this time postmarked from Seattle, Washington. It contained 3 graduation photographs, showing young adults in caps and gowns who bore an even stronger resemblance to her missing children. The photograph quality was better this time, clearly showing faces that had matured from the teenagers in the previous picture. Again, The message on the back was written in block letters: "College graduates, you should be proud." This second contact reinvigorated the investigation. Detective Chen worked with federal authorities to analyze the photographs and trace their origin, but again came up empty. The images appeared to be genuine graduation photographs, not manipulated or staged, but without being able to definitively identify the subjects, they provided more questions than answers. DNA analysis wasn't possible without biological samples, and attempts to trace the photographs through college databases proved fruitless due to privacy restrictions and the sheer number of possible institutions across the country. Maria was now 58 years old and had spent more years missing her children than she had spent raising them. The community that had once rallied around her had largely moved on, with many of the original families having relocated as Detroit's economic situation continued to deteriorate. The house at 2847 Gratiot Avenue was now one of the few occupied homes on a block that had seen better days. But Maria refused all offers from the city to relocate her to public housing. Sister Margaret had left Detroit in 2005 to care for her aging parents in Boston, but she maintained regular contact with Maria through letters and occasional phone calls. She had never forgiven herself for those few minutes when she had looked away from the playground, and she carried the guilt of that Tuesday morning like a physical weight. In her letters, she always asked if there had been any news about the children, and she continued to pray for their safe return every day. The neighborhood around St. Bartholomew's had changed dramatically over the years. The church itself closed in 2012, a victim of declining membership and the archdiocese's financial problems. The building was eventually sold to a developer who converted it into artist studios, but the basement where the summer program had been held remained largely unchanged. Sometimes Maria would walk past the old church and peer through the windows at the space where her children had spent their last morning, trying to imagine what the man in the tiger's cap had said to convince them to leave with him. By 2015, Detective Chen had been promoted to lieutenant and was no longer working active cases, but he continued to review the Santos file periodically, hoping that advancing technology might reveal something that had been missed. Cold case investigations had become increasingly successful with the advent of genetic genealogy and improved database searches. But the Santos case lacked the physical evidence that made such breakthroughs possible. Maria's 70th birthday passed quietly in 2017, marked only by a small gathering of neighbors who had remained in the area and a few relatives from Texas who made the trip to Detroit. She had become a fixture in the community, the woman who had lost her children, and younger residents knew her story, even if they hadn't lived through the original tragedy. Her house had become an unofficial memorial, with strangers sometimes leaving flowers on her front porch or stopping to offer words of sympathy. The third and final communication came in 2018, 32 years after the disappearance. This time, the envelope contained wedding photographs showing 3 couples in formal attire. The faces of the brides and grooms were unmistakably those of the teenagers and college graduates from the previous photographs, now clearly adults in their early 30s. The message on the back was longer this time. They have found happiness and love. They remember you with joy, not sadness. Detective Chen, now working in administration but still maintaining an interest in the case, subjected these photographs to the most sophisticated analysis available. Facial recognition software indicated a high probability that the subjects were the same individuals from the previous photographs, suggesting a consistent pattern of communication over more than 20 years. However, without confirmed identities for any of the individuals in the pictures, this didn't constitute proof that they were the Santos triplets. The photographs were also analyzed by behavioral experts who noted that the settings and formal wear suggested traditional wedding ceremonies. indicating that whoever the subjects were, they had been integrated into conventional social structures. If these were indeed the Santos children, the images suggested they had been raised in circumstances that allowed them to pursue education, careers, and normal adult relationships. Maria studied these latest photographs with a magnifying glass, trying to find definitive proof that these were her children. The woman she believed was Sofia had her father's eyes and Maria's stubborn chin. The man she thought was Carlos had the same slightly crooked smile that had charmed teachers and neighbors when he was 11. The man she was convinced was Miguel held himself with the same thoughtful posture that had characterized him as a child. But resemblances weren't proof, and after 32 years, Maria had begun to question her own memories and observations. The investigation into the wedding photographs revealed that they had been professionally taken and appeared to be legitimate rather than staged. The background suggested upscale venues in different locations, indicating that if these were the Santos children, they had established separate lives in different parts of the country. This detail was particularly significant to investigators, as it suggested careful planning to prevent the siblings from accidentally crossing paths with people from their past. In 2019, Maria's health took a serious turn when she suffered a mild stroke that left her with some difficulty speaking and walking. During her recovery, she spent long hours looking through photo albums and newspaper clippings from the investigation, organizing everything into chronological order and adding handwritten notes about her memories and theories. Her goal was to create a complete record that could be useful to investigators if any new developments occurred after her death. The stroke had also affected her short-term memory, though her recollections of events from 1986 remained crystal clear. She could describe in perfect detail what each child had been wearing that last Tuesday morning, the conversation they had over breakfast, and the sound of their voices calling goodbye as they left for the community center. These memories had been polished by decades of repetition, but they remained the most precious things she possessed. Detective Chen, despite his administrative responsibilities, continued to monitor databases for any matches to the Santos case. He had entered the children's DNA profiles, reconstructed from biological samples found in their bedrooms, into every available system. He regularly checked missing persons reports for cases that might be connected, and he maintained contact with FBI agents who specialized in long-term abduction cases. In late 2019, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A genealogy research company that had been working with law enforcement to solve cold cases contacted Detective Chen about a potential match in their database. A woman in Oregon had submitted DNA for genealogy research and had matched with several relatives in the Detroit area, despite having no known family connections to Michigan. When investigators contacted her to ask about her background, she revealed that she had been adopted as a teenager and had no memory of her early childhood. The woman, who was now 34 years old and working as an elementary school teacher in Portland, agreed to meet with investigators. Physical examination revealed several characteristics that matched descriptions of Sofia Santos, including a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder that Maria had mentioned during the original investigation. However, the woman had no conscious memory of her life before the age of approximately 15, when she had been placed with an adoptive family who told her she had been found wandering alone in Phoenix after what appeared to be a traumatic experience. DNA testing confirmed what investigators and Maria had hoped and feared. The woman was indeed Sofia Santos. The confirmation brought overwhelming relief that at least one of her children was alive and well, but it also raised painful questions about what had happened to the boys and why Sofia had no memory of her earlier life. Medical examinations suggested that her amnesia was likely the result of psychological trauma rather than physical injury. indicating that whatever had occurred during her captivity had been severe enough to cause her mind to protect itself by forgetting. Sophia, who had been living under the name Jennifer Walsh for nearly 20 years, was initially overwhelmed by the revelation of her true identity. She had built a life based on the assumption that her past was forever lost, and learning that she had a mother who had never stopped searching for her was both miraculous and deeply disturbing. The adoptive parents who had raised her were elderly now and had passed away several years earlier, taking with them any knowledge they might have had about the circumstances of her placement with their family. The reunion between Maria and Sophia took place in early 2020, arranged carefully by social services and attended by counselors who specialized in trauma recovery. Maria, now 73 and still recovering from her stroke, wept when she saw the daughter she had last embraced as an 11-year-old child. Sophia, meanwhile, struggled with feelings that were both familiar and foreign, as if she were meeting someone from a half-remembered dream. Over the following months, Sophia worked with therapists to try to recover memories of her childhood and the events that had led to her separation from her family. The process was slow and often painful, with fragments of memory emerging in dreams and unexpected moments of recognition. She remembered the taste of her mother's cooking, the sound of her brother's laughter, and the feeling of safety that had characterized her early life. But the traumatic events that had ended, that life remained largely blocked. What Sophia was able to remember, with the help of therapy and time spent in her childhood home, provided investigators with their first real leads in over 3 decades. She recalled being held in a place that smelled like motor oil and cigarettes, possibly an auto repair shop or garage. She remembered a woman with red hair who had been kind to her and had sung lullabies in a language she didn't recognize. Most significantly, she remembered being separated from her brothers after what felt like several months, and being told that she was going to a new family who would take good care of her. These recovered memories suggested that the triplets had initially been kept together, but had eventually been separated and placed with different families or individuals. The fact that Sophia had ultimately ended up in legitimate adoptive care suggested that at least part of the operation had been designed to place the children in what the perpetrators believed were better living situations. This theory was supported by the photographs Maria had received over the years, which seemed designed to reassure her that her children were safe and thriving. The investigation into Sophia's recovered memories led detectives to explore connections between Detroit and Phoenix, looking for individuals or organizations that might have been involved in moving children between the two cities in the 1980s and 1990s. They discovered several cases from that time period involving questionable adoptions and children who had been removed from their families under dubious circumstances, suggesting a possible pattern of activity by individuals or groups who justified their actions as rescuing children from poverty or danger. DNA testing also revealed that Sophia had 2 children of her own, 5-year-old twins who carried the genetic legacy of the Santos family. When Maria met her grandchildren for the first time, she saw echoes of Carlos and Miguel in their faces and mannerisms, a bittersweet reminder of the sons she was still missing. The children brought new purpose to her life, and she threw herself into the role of grandmother with the energy she had been saving for her own children's return. The search for Carlos and Miguel intensified with the new information Sophia had provided. But despite extensive investigation of the leads she had remembered, no trace of the boys was found. The auto repair shop she remembered could have been anywhere in the country, and the red-haired woman might have been involved peripherally or might have been another victim of the same operation. The trail remained cold, complicated by the passage of 34 years and the possibility that the boys had been moved through multiple locations and caretakers. In 2021, Sophia decided to take her mother's maiden name and become Sophia Santos Walsh, honoring both her birth family and the adoptive parents who had raised her. She also decided to relocate to Detroit with her children, wanting to be closer to Maria and to help continue the search for her brothers. The decision was difficult because it meant leaving the life she had built in Oregon, but she felt a deep need to reconnect with her roots and to give her children the opportunity to know their grandmother. The house at 2847 Gratiot Avenue, which had stood empty except for Maria for so many years, came alive again with the sound of children's voices and laughter. Sophia's twins, Isabella and Roberto, named after their great-grandparents, brought joy that Maria had not experienced since 1986. They played in the same backyard where the triplets had spent their last morning, and they slept in the bedrooms that had been preserved like shrines for over 3 decades. Sophia struggled with the weight of being the only survivor found so far, feeling guilty that she had been rescued while her brothers remained missing. She underwent intensive therapy to deal with survivors' guilt and the complex emotions that came with recovering a past she had lost. The process was made more difficult by her mother's declining health and the pressure she felt to remember details that might help find Carlos and Miguel. Maria's joy at having Sophia and her grandchildren with her was tempered by the knowledge that her time was limited. The stroke had been followed by other health problems, and doctors had made it clear that she might only have a few more years. She spent every possible moment with her daughter and grandchildren, trying to make up for the lost decades and to pass on family traditions and stories that Sophia had no memory of. In late 2021, a private investigator hired by Sophia made contact with a man in Texas who might have been Carlos. The individual had been adopted as a teenager in the early 1990s and had been told that his family had died in an accident, but he had always felt that something about his story didn't add up. Physical characteristics and age were consistent with Carlos Santos, and he had memories of having siblings, though these memories were vague and might have been influenced by suggestion. The potential Carlos, who had been living under the name David Rodriguez and working as a high school mathematics teacher in San Antonio, agreed to DNA testing, but warned that he had built a life based on his adopted identity and wasn't sure he wanted to disrupt it even if the test proved he was a Santos. His adoptive parents had died several years earlier, and he had no family connections that might be disrupted by the revelation of his true identity, but he had a wife and children who only knew him as David Rodriguez. The DNA test results, which came back in early 2022, confirmed that David Rodriguez was indeed Carlos Santos. The confirmation was both a triumph and a complication, as it meant that 2 of the triplets were now alive and accounted for, but it also meant dealing with Carlos's reluctance to fully embrace his original identity. He had suffered his own trauma during the missing years, including psychological abuse designed to make him forget his past, and he had spent decades building a life based on the story his adoptive family had told him. Unlike Sophia, Carlos had clear memories of his childhood and the day he and his siblings had been taken from the playground. He remembered the man in the tiger's cap, showing them photographs of a baseball stadium and telling them that their mother had been hurt and was in the hospital. The man had claimed to be a family friend who had been sent to bring them to see her, and in their panic and confusion, they had followed him willingly. Carlos remembered being held with his siblings in what he now believed was an abandoned farmhouse outside Detroit for several weeks, while their captors decided what to do with them. He recalled being given new clothes and new names, and being told repeatedly that their mother had died and that they were now part of a new family. The psychological manipulation had been sophisticated and persistent, designed to make the children accept their new situation and stop trying to return to their old lives. The farmhouse where they had been held was described as being surrounded by cornfields and having a red barn that was falling down, But these details weren't specific enough to identify a location 36 years later. Carlos also remembered a woman who had taken care of them during their captivity, someone who seemed kind but who participated in the deception by supporting the story that their mother was dead and that they needed to forget their past in order to be happy in their new lives. According to Carlos's memories, he had been separated from his siblings after about 6 weeks at the farmhouse and had been driven to a family in Texas who had been told he was an orphan whose relatives had died in a car accident. His adoptive parents, who had been unable to have children of their own, had asked few questions about his background and had focused on helping him adjust to his new life. They had been kind and loving parents, but they had also been firm about discouraging his attempts to talk about his memories of his previous life. The revelation that Carlos was alive and well, with a successful career and a family of his own, brought immense joy to Maria and Sofia. The reunion between the siblings was emotional and complex, with Sofia recognizing her brother immediately, despite the decades that had passed, while Carlos struggled to reconcile his memories of his little sister with the grown woman standing before him. Both siblings wept as they remembered playing together in their backyard and walking to the community center on that last morning. Carlos's wife and children were initially shocked by the revelation of his true identity, but they gradually came to understand the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his early life. His wife, Elena, was particularly moved by meeting Maria and learning about the decades of searching and hoping that had never ended. She encouraged Carlos to embrace his Santos identity while maintaining the relationships and commitments he had built as David Rodriguez. With 2 of the triplets found, the search for Miguel intensified. Carlos was able to provide additional details about their captivity and separation that gave investigators new leads to follow. He remembered that Miguel had been crying when they were separated, and that one of their captors had mentioned taking him to a family who specifically wanted a boy who was good with books and learning. This detail suggested that the placement of the children might have been based on matching their personalities and interests with their new families. Carlos also remembered overhearing conversations between their captors about the children being placed with families who couldn't have children of their own and who had been carefully screened to ensure they would provide good homes. This information supported the theory that the kidnapping had been motivated not by malice, but by a misguided belief that the children would have better lives with more affluent families. The perpetrators seemed to have convinced themselves that they were rescuing the children from poverty rather than committing a terrible crime. In mid-2022, a breakthrough came when genealogy researchers identified several DNA matches that suggested Miguel might be living in Colorado. The matches were distant cousins who had submitted their DNA for genealogy research, but the pattern of matches was consistent with someone who was related to the Santos family, but who had grown up outside of Michigan. Investigators contacted law enforcement in Colorado, who began searching adoption records and missing person reports from the 1980s and 1990s. The Colorado investigation led to a man named Thomas Chen, a librarian in Denver who had been adopted as a teenager and who had always felt that his adoption story didn't quite make sense. When contacted by investigators, he revealed that he had vague memories of having siblings and living in a place with lots of cars and industrial noise, which was consistent with growing up in Detroit. Physical characteristics and age were consistent with Miguel Santos, and his career as a librarian matched the personality traits that had characterized Miguel as a child. Thomas had been placed with an adoptive family when he was approximately 15 years old, with documents indicating that his previous family had died in an accident and that he had suffered psychological trauma that affected his memory. His adoptive parents had been told that he might never remember his past clearly, and they had focused on helping him build a new life rather than encouraging him to dwell on what had been lost. Like Carlos, he had been raised by loving parents who had given him opportunities for education and personal growth. DNA testing confirmed that Thomas Chen was Miguel Santos, making the reunion of the triplets complete after 36 years. Miguel's memories of their captivity were similar to those shared by Carlos, though he had additional details about the people who had cared for them during those weeks at the farmhouse. He remembered a man who had talked to them about books and education, telling them that their new families would make sure they could go to college and have opportunities they wouldn't have had in their previous life. Miguel also remembered being told that staying together would be dangerous because people would be looking for 3 children but wouldn't recognize them if they were separated and given new identities. The psychological manipulation had been designed to make them believe that separation was necessary for their safety and that trying to find each other or return to their mother would put everyone in danger. This explained why none of the triplets had attempted to search for their family once they were old enough to do so. The final reunion took place at Christmas 2022. With all 3 siblings and their families gathering at the house on Gratiot Avenue where their story had begun. Maria, now 75 and in fragile health, was surrounded by her children and grandchildren for the first time since 1986. The gathering was both joyful and bittersweet, celebrating the miracle of the family's reunion while acknowledging the decades of separation and trauma that could never be undone. Sophia's children, Isabella and Roberto, met their uncles for the first time and immediately bonded with Carlos's children and Miguel's adopted daughter. The house, that had been so quiet for so many years, was filled with the sound of children playing and adults sharing stories and memories. Maria spent the day moving slowly from room to room, touching each of her children and grandchildren as if to convince herself that they were really there. The investigation into the original kidnapping continued, with investigators now having detailed memories from all 3 victims that could be combined to create a more complete picture of what had happened. The farmhouse where they had been held was identified as likely being in rural Oakland County, based on details about the drive from the city and the surrounding landscape. However, searches of properties in that area that had been abandoned or sold during the relevant time period didn't yield any definitive evidence. The man in the tiger's cap who had initially approached the children at the playground was believed to have been part of a larger network of people involved in what investigators now believed was an illegal adoption ring that operated across multiple states. The network appeared to have targeted children from low-income families, justifying their actions with the belief that they were providing better opportunities for children who might otherwise grow up in poverty. Physical evidence from the case had long since been lost or degraded beyond usefulness, and many of the people who might have been involved were likely dead or too elderly to face prosecution. The focus shifted from criminal justice to understanding what had happened and helping the Santos family heal from their long separation. Counselors worked with the entire family to address the complex emotions and relationships that had resulted from the decades of separation and reunion. Maria's health continued to decline through 2023, but she was determined to live long enough to see her grandchildren grow and to help her own children process their traumatic experiences. She spent her days telling them stories about their father and their early childhood, sharing family history and traditions that had been lost during their years apart. Her voice was often weak from the effects of her stroke, but her memory remained clear when it came to the details of their shared past. In March 2024, Maria Santos passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her death marked the end of a nearly 4-decade journey of hope, loss, and eventual reunion, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Santos family. Sofia, Carlos, and Miguel, now all in their 40s with children of their own, committed to maintaining the close family bonds that their mother had never stopped believing would someday be restored. The house at 2847 Gratiot Avenue was sold to a young family with children, bringing new life to a building that had served as both a shrine to loss and a beacon of hope for so many years. Sofia kept her mother's belongings and the documentation of the long search, planning to someday write a book about their experience that might help other families facing similar tragedies. She also established a foundation to support families of missing children and to fund research into improving methods for solving long-term disappearance cases. Carlos returned to Texas but maintained close contact with his siblings and made regular trips to Detroit to visit the places where they had grown up together. He began working with organizations that helped reunite families separated by trafficking and illegal adoption, using his experience and knowledge to help other people find their missing relatives. His own children grew up understanding that family connections could survive even the most difficult separations, and they embraced their extended family with enthusiasm and love. Miguel settled permanently in Colorado, but bought a house large enough to host regular family gatherings, where all the siblings and their children could spend time together. He became involved in literacy programs for disadvantaged children, partly as a way of honoring the memory of their mother, who had always emphasized the importance of education. His work at the library expanded to include research assistance for families trying to trace missing relatives and genealogical connections. The Santos case became a model for other investigations involving long-term missing children, demonstrating that families separated by crime could be reunited even decades later through persistence, advancing technology, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Detective Chen, who had worked on the case for most of his career, often spoke at conferences about the importance of never closing missing person cases and continuing to pursue leads, no matter how much time had passed. Sister Margaret, who had remained in contact with the family throughout the long search, was able to attend Maria's funeral and to meet the adult versions of the children she had last seen as 11-year-olds. The guilt she had carried for 38 years was finally eased by understanding that the children had grown up to be successful, loving adults who bore no resentment about what had happened that day at the playground. She continued to pray for all families facing similar tragedies, understanding that miracles could take decades to unfold. The story of the Santos triplets became a testament to the power of a mother's love and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. Maria's refusal to give up hope, even when everyone else had moved on, ultimately led to the reunion that had seemed impossible for so many years. Her legacy lived on in the close-knit family that her children created for their own children, and in the knowledge that love could survive any separation if it was strong enough and patient enough to endure. In the end, the mystery of what happened on that August morning in 1986 was largely solved, though many questions remained about the specific identities and motivations of the people responsible. The most important truth was that 3 children who had been torn from their mother's arms had grown up to be good people who found their way back to each other and to the love that had never stopped searching for them. The 36 years of separation could never be recovered, but the years ahead held the promise of a family reunited and a story that would inspire hope in other families facing similar heartbreak.